This is the third and final video for Art112, looking at the realist movement. In these three videos, we have looked at how the realist method is exemplified by three characteristics. First of all, the selections of motifs of everyday life. Second, the use of composition to situate the viewer within the motif. And third, a greater attention to and emphasis on the materiality of paint as distinct from the illusion of the subject. To discuss this emphasis on material, which we see in Gustave Courbet's painting The Source of the Lou, which, by the way, is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and hangs in the same gallery with Rosa Bonheur's The Horse Fair. In fact, they hang across each other in the same room. You can stand in one spot and look at the Horse Fair. If you turn around, you'll see The Source of the Lou. In any case, in discussing Courbet's emphasis on materiality in this painting, we should distinguish between two terms. The first term is picture, and the second term is painting. The term picture refers to what we see in this work of art that is an illusion. The rocks, the water, the building. If you touch this painting at the Met, first of all, I'll fail you in this class. I'm just joking. But if you touch this painting, you'll be in trouble. But if you touch this painting, you will find that it is not wet. Right? The water is not wet. Because the water is not real. The water is an illusion. What is real is the material of the paint. What is real is Courbet's use of white. What is real is Courbet's use of black. Color is real. Paint is real. And Courbet, as a realist painter, emphasizes these real qualities of his art. One of the artists who was really influential on Courbet was an artist named Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot. And here we see a painting entitled The Forest of Fontainebleau. Fontainebleau was a forest that was not very far from Paris, and many artists went there to paint. If we divide Corot's painting into two vertical halves, we can see that one side of this work is a picture. There's a young woman reading. The landscape extends extensively into the distance towards the horizon. The illusion of three-dimensional space is very convincing. The other side of the work is dominated by a very large tree. And the way in which that tree spreads out across the composition flattens the composition. There's less of a sense of pictorial depth. Compared to the left side of Corot's work, the right side has considerably less pictorial depth. Instead, what you have is an emphasis on paint. On one of his trips to Fontainebleau, Corot made this very small sketch. This is a very tiny work. A sketch that Corot made in the forest of a large tree. And in a much larger painting, a painting of a biblical subject, Hagar in the wilderness, we can see how Corot has transplanted his tree from the forest of Fontainebleau into an imaginary biblical landscape. And in this way, we can see Corot being different from the realist movement. Because in this painting, Corot is creating a landscape from his imagination. Rather than depicting a landscape that he observes, he's creating a landscape of the imagination. This is a painting by Corot entitled The Curious Little Girl. The viewer seems to have captured an unidentified young girl in the act of spying over a wall. We can see that there is on the ground by her feet a large rock that perhaps she's been standing on to look over the wall. And we've caught her in the act. The way in which she stands against the wall establishes what we call in art history a figure-ground relationship. And that figure-ground relationship is very important to the creation of the picture as an illusion. But in Corot's painting, he both establishes pictorial distance through the placement of the girl against the wall, and also creates spatial ambiguity with the trees that we see beyond the wall. How tall are those trees? We can't tell. Corot doesn't give us enough information for us to tell if those are large trees that are in the distance or smaller trees that are closer to the wall. There's a spatial ambiguity between the wall and the trees. And so in this work, Corot is playing a kind of game. It's a very deliberate and careful game, a game that's something like chess. But he gives and he takes away. He establishes pictorial distance and he takes away pictorial distance. And in a late landscape by Corot, we see a similar strategy of simultaneously establishing pictorial distance and then blurring it. Through the trees, we can see a lake and a distant landscape. And yet the trees and the branches and the leaves crisscross the surface of the painting, obscuring the picture. The picture, as an illusion of space, is deliberately obscured by the painting of the trees as material paint on the surface of the canvas. If we come back to Courbet's painting, we can see how he's learned certain lessons from Corot. In this case, he's made a painting of trees on the side of a hill. Now, as a motif, the hill rises vertically, which corresponds to the actual verticality of the composition. The hill, as a motif, rises vertically, and Courbet's composition on the surface of his canvas also rises vertically. And so he's found a motif that suits his purpose of creating a composition that is increasingly pictorially flat. And by creating a composition that is increasingly pictorially flat, Courbet is able to emphasize the materiality of the surface. Courbet was particularly adept at painting rocks. If we look at this painting of a cliffside that is in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago, we can see how he has used the dense materiality of paint, applied with a palette knife, actually smeared onto the surface with a palette knife, such that the density of the paint is laid bare on the surface of the canvas. And if we return to the work by Courbet that we started with, we see again Courbet doing something in this work that we already observed Corot doing with the curious little girl. He is simultaneously establishing pictorial space and denying pictorial space. Right? He establishes pictorial space through diagonal lines that move towards a vanishing point. The edges of the water are diagonals that run towards a vanishing point that is in the cave. Right? If we look at a landscape by Jacob van Ruysdael, we can see how he uses the edges of the road to point us towards a vanishing point that is on the horizon. And in fact, in a painting by Corot, we see him using the same technique. He uses the road to establish lines of perspective that move towards a vanishing point that is on the horizon. And if we return to the work by Courbet and we follow the lines of perspective to the vanishing point, we end up in a dark cave. The darkness of the cave, the blackness of the cave, denies the vanishing point. The vanishing point in this painting has been taken away. And as such, the painting moves from being pictorial, moving towards a vanishing point, to being flat. Flat like the side of the cliff that Courbet paints so beautifully with the palette knife. In this painting, we see Courbet creating a work in which he is deliberately challenging the pictorial aspects of the work, the illusionistic aspects of the work. And instead of making a picture, Courbet is making a painting.